Oh, I actually should. Hello, guys. Yeah, we are supposed to start 2 minutes earlier, 2 minutes already, but we are 2 minutes late now. We have very full agenda today because we actually moved one of the slides presentation from yesterday. It takes 10 minutes, but we hope we can manage to reduce that to 5. So I would like to ask all the presenters to keep your time slots only, not going too much. So let's start. So first would be me. You can stay. Okay. This should really be done yesterday, so I will try to be quick. Autonomical prefix management in large-scale network. Next page, please. The motivation is first, that's a valid case. In large-scale networks, we have very complicated task to manage all those prefix assignment. I did receive a response, say, prefix delegation using DHCP already could do prefix delegation, yes. But here, what we are motivated.
Just quick question. Do we have a note taker? Did Laurent? Did you? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Where are we?
Sorry.
Yeah. But this is not only about prefix delegation. It's about how to manage the prefix in a very large scale, which maybe if you use PD, that means you have to manage every devices by manual or by set up the PD process manually. But within autonomic network, what we try to achieve is, the human operator only manage one or a very minimal set of parameters, like the prefix for the whole network. Then all the rest could be done by just set up a set of rows and the lengths of prefix for each rows, maybe together 4 or 5 parameters managed the whole network. Also, one of the reasons we have this use case in our current charter is to validate the application and usability of other ANIMA components. Okay, next page. The process, a prefix requires data that needs new or more addresses. First, discover where it can get the prefix. So that uses the generic discovery mechanism from GRISP, the generic autonomic signaling protocol. By setting out a discovery message that contains a prefix objective option, then the devices can obtain or negotiate with the discovered devices for a prefix allocation through the grasp. Within a single administrative domain, the network operator could manage all their devices with a given role set, like 4 or 5 rows. Then a prefix management intent, which contains all the mapping information of devices rows to their default prefix length. Should be flat to all those devices. Then every devices could match their own rows to know what prefix lengths they need to negotiate. The intent flooding mechanism is currently missing, and today later we have the related work in information distribution over grasp. That will be presentation later. The discovery, negotiation, and flooding message should go through autonomic control plan, which is already our working group draft presented yesterday. That means in this use case, we use both grasp and SAP. Next, please. This is an example we're giving the prefix management intent in SABLE. In this example, we just have 3 rows. Each row, like RST, has the prefix length 34, and AST has 44, CST has 56. That's all information, in this use case, you give out. Yeah. Then, no matter how many nodes you have, in some networks, these 3 types may cover up to 1,000 devices. Then all those devices, either RC, AST, or CST, could know what prefix lengths they try to get. Then they can autonomically discover what's the upper layer devices, which devices has the prefix resource could allocate it to it. Then negotiation, by negotiation to get that prefix allocated. As simple as that, if the autonomic negotiation function is introduced. For now, we still use the word intent. Later today, we will discuss the intent concept and format. Whether this is kept the name to be intent or not is another discussion. Whatever the following discuss may reach the conclusion, we will use a different term for that. Okay, basically that's it. Okay, I have 5 minutes, then you have 5 minutes. We'll call adopt after 5 presentations.
Yeah. You know when you want to do it.
Okay. Sure. That's yours.
Right, so a quick update on the stable connectivity. I gave a longer update in before, so just change this next slide since last IETF. So I came up with all these, what I thought good operational and technical reasons and wrote that in the document through the discussion we had at the last IETF and the mailing list thereafter. That's basically, we want to focus on the long-term simplicity and want to have a simple address family because, operators prefer that, increases complexity, and we think, and we see already in service providers how V4 becomes a service on top of V6. And so when we look in what should be the focus of the draft is the mid and long-term goals, and then basically rather have crazy workarounds for short-term than basically encumber the long-term solution with too much work that's only potentially beneficial short-term, right? That's why there are these crazy workarounds in the draft of how can you connect IPv4 NOC to the autonomic control plane short-term. And after I have written this slide, my area director came up with a much easier explanation. He said IPv4 in the ACP would simply be out of scope, and I'll have to go reread our charter again to see. But okay, so that was one of the 2 points. Second point, next slide. ULA discussion. So we had discussions about what type of local addresses we wanted to use in the ACP, and from the operational perspective, which is the only thing that is relevant here in this draft, not kind of the functional ones, because that's in the ACP drafts. So one of the points being raised, for example, considering whether this could recreate interest in ULAC, where the addresses would actually be more assigned, is how to recognize leaked ACP packets. And so we had discussions about that, and what my perception from the discussion on the mailing list was, and going through that, first of all, there are already existing services on the internet where you can register, not allocate, but register your ULA addresses. And now they're not authoritative. So you might need to register to multiple ones if somebody else wants to find your addresses. But maybe that is actually good enough for the moment, and we don't need to worry about this anymore, especially because one thing happened in the evolution of our drafts in the IETF over the last few times, and that is by making the ACP mandatory, the leakage options actually will be severely reduced, right? So basically, by always being encrypted, by always being separate, the ACP does actually, minimize the likelihood for leakage. So the conclusion was really just to write down these things in more detail in the draft and say that ULA, as it is right now, you can self-register if you like to any place that has such service is good for the use case that is described in this draft. So these are basically the 2 changes. We didn't receive comments on anything else, so we feel that the draft is fairly stable around the generic use case it's trying to describe. Next slide. I'm trying to get some feedback from MIF about what I said as a tail end of the solution suite, which is that if the transport stack could actually use in a single connection in protocols like MPTCP, for example, both the ACP and the data plane, you'd get best of both worlds. And so, I'm just trying to figure out how to get some more feedback from other working groups about that. But other than that, I think, yeah, in the same way, asking for adoption when we're doing this, when the right slot.
Okay. To save our time, we'll ask those adopting questions later after we present the addressing ACP. Bin, you have 15 minutes.
Hello, everyone. This is Bin Liu, presenting the information distribution over GRASP. We briefly mentioned it in yesterday's GRASP discussion. Next, please. Actually, this draft is inherited from the previous version, which is intent distribution. We've noticed that maybe it's not necessary to limit the information to only intent. Intent is only one of the information that need to be distributed. And in this new version, we make it more explicit that it is achieved upon the GRASP protocol. So we did some scenario analysis of the distribution and the requirement analysis. And then we make some gap analysis according to the current GRASP. Next, please. Okay, the scenarios mainly contains 3. The first one is quite obvious. The whole domain distribution is mostly regarding to flooding. And the selective distribution, we just mentioned in last discussion of GRASP. Here we listed 2 possible scenarios of selective distribution. One is that we can distribute some specific policies to the autonomic nodes that support a certain objective. And this could be done possibly according to the discovery results, which is cached in the autonomic nodes. Another is we distribute some information only to the nodes that belong to a certain role. For example, just as shown, presented in his prefix management scenario, in the API network, there are mainly 3 or 4 roles, ASG, RSG, etc. We can distribute the information to specific roles, or we distribute the information that to the nodes located in the certain hierarchy, so that in this way we could possibly reduce the signaling storm. And if the information is more or less sensitive, then it is a benefit to gain some information isolation. Of course, it's not instead of the authentication and authorization, but this is some simple way to gain isolation in some degree. Okay, the last one is the incremental distribution. It's mostly unicast. One typical usage is for the nodes that newly get aligned or the nodes just awake from sleeping state. Next, please. Okay, this slide shows the basic requirement for a autonomic node behavior. It's quite obvious. The nodes should be able to flood the information to all interfaces, including both physical interfaces and the ACP tunnels. And if we follow the approach we discussed yesterday, the grasp should be run in ACP as default. So I think this should follow the same approach. And the node needs some mechanism to avoid loops in the network as much as possible. And for selective flooding, the node need to select the interfaces that need to be flooded to the flood the information. And maybe he also need to flood to a set of IP addresses through a combination of multiple unicast L3 communication. And then the last one is a point-to-point exchange for the incremental distribution. Next, please. This shows the basic requirement for protocol indication, which means the protocol need to indicate the information carried in the message need to be distributed, so that the autonomic node could distinguish this information out of the normal information. And for selective flooding, we need some indication what's the criteria to select the interfaces out of all the interfaces. Next, please. Okay, the gap analysis. For the node behavior, we need to flood within the ACP. So it's quite, actually there's no essential problem of flooding ACP because in a node perspective, the ACP is just a kind of interface. But the question is, shall we distinguish the ACP tunnel? In another way, should the autonomic node to recognize the ACP interfaces rather than normal interfaces? And for loop avoidance, the current grasp defines some mechanisms to reduce the loop impact, but there's no comprehensive solution to avoid the loop. And for the protocol indication, current grasp use a unsolicited response message. Once a autonomic node receives such kind of message itself, the message itself means the information carried in the unsolicited responses need to be flooded. So the message itself is kind of indication. But the concern is the unsolicited response is a kind of overloading of response messages. So in general consideration, the overloading might make some trouble for the implementation. If the implementers doesn't have a very careful design, then there might be an error prone. So we listed some alternative. We can define a new message instead of overloading the current response message. And this message is dedicated for information distribution. And we can also define a new option dedicated for distribution. These options could be possibly included in the request or negotiation message. Or we add some flags in current message option to indicate the distribution. So the open question to the working group, which one you consider is the most proper one? In my personal tendency, I prefer the first one. We just define new type of message to do this job. And for the selective flood indication, we can carry the criteria inbound of the message. For example, the message indicates a role and an objective. And we can also follow a publications, a subscribe and publication mode. The nodes need to subscribe to the specific information it wants to distribute it. But if we follow this way, the problem should be the pub/sub mode mostly implies a central distribution source, which is more or less contrast to the ANIMA reference model. And also the pub/sub between neighbors might be too heavy for signaling. So my personal prefer is the first one. We can carry the criteria inbound the message. But we'd like to hear other opinions. Okay, here are some other more sophisticated requirements along with those basic requirements. The first one is the autonomic domain boundary. If one node receives the distribution message or the distribution option, he needs to decide whether he to distribute it again. If he is the boundary of the autonomic domain, then he should stop do the distribution. And ideally, the distributed information could be injected in an arbitrary autonomic node. This is actually an authorization problem. And confliction handling, there's possibility that two nodes advertise the same distributed information, then how to handle the conflict. And the last one is the verification of the information. There are two aspects. One is the integrity verification to check whether the information has been modified. And it also needs to authorize the source, whether it has a privilege to distribute such kind of information. Okay, next, please. This draft is still in the, yes, Michael?
No, finish.
Yes, I think this is just for discussion.
Okay. Michael Berenger. There's one thing that confused the hell out of me. Distributing on non-ACP interfaces. Are you really suggesting that? In my mind, intent is something that only floods in the ACP. The ACP is only within that automatically defines the domain boundary. So also the question you had on the last slide becomes irrelevant. Why do you want to, here the first bullet on this slide,
Yes.
why do you actually want to distribute it outside the ACP?
Actually, the background is in previous graphs, it is optional to run in ACP. But if we follow the approach that running in ACP is by default, then I think this question doesn't bother too much anymore.
Okay, I think in the reference document, we've come to the conclusion that the ACP is mandatory and all nodes will have the ACP. And that to me defines then the domain. We have a way to define what joins the ACP and what not by subdomains and whatever. So we steer the creation of the ACP, and then intent just follows that basically, that intent distribution. That was my view.
Yes, the distribution actually nothing beyond the graph. If graph run in ACP, then it is naturally within the ACP. There's no other.
And that is the end of the line. So you are the end of the line. No one after you. No, we're just trying to cut the line for time purposes.
Oh.
No, you are still fine. I just wanted to make sure nobody else is up.
Pierre Peloso. I'm having a question regarding the nature of the information. I thought I understand from your draft that the nature of the information is conveyed, but I want to make sure we agree on what this is. You mean when you distribute an information, when you need to advertise what this information is? If the information you distribute is the load of link, for example, you need to have, like we have in the objective, there's the objective name. So in the objective name, you can state this is the load of the link between router A and router B. Okay, so this is this something in the draft? So because when I read the draft, I was not sure that this was inside. And then the flooding option would be on people who are interested to know who are the customers of the link load between router A and B. Is this?
My understanding is this is a question similar to yesterday's discussion, what the intelligence is located. For graphs, it is mostly messaging. The distribution is also the similar consideration. It doesn't deal with the content, what the information is, how to interpret the information. The draft doesn't deal with that kind of thing. That should be belong to a specific ASAs.
I would slightly disagree with that, because if you want to distribute an information, you have to know, you don't need to understand what that means, the load of the link between A and B, but you need to have this stated and that someone can parse this out. And especially if you want to distribute this to all the customers of this information, you need to have a way to find this, and it is linked to discovery. I think so, really.
Could you repeat again? I didn't quite follow you.
We have to take this discussion to the mailing list.
I'll bring this to the
You're welcome to make comments.
How many people have read the draft? Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. So yesterday we spoke about the autonomic control plane. The autonomic control plane is an overlay, and in the autonomic control plane there is addressing. Because inside we want to have the possibility that any node can talk to any other node, so they need the IP addressing for that to happen. The ACP is meant to be self-managing. In other words, we do not want an operator to have to assign address space or anything to that. It should just happen automatically. So we have a proposal on how to do this address assignment in an automatic way, and that is for discussion here. The basics of it you have probably seen before. We do need to sort of start sensing agreement and where there's still need for clarification. Okay, next slide, please. So the idea is self-management, as I just said. Every autonomic node gets an address. Again, node is not just router. Node is anything that's autonomic. Router, switch, call manager, telephone, whatever. Right? An autonomic node can be anything. We have previously decided, and I just want to recap that, it's not the autonomic function or the ASA, the autonomic service agent, that gets an address. It's the node that gets an address. So all the messaging that we do, the grasps and the like, need to be able to multiplex various ASAs on a node. And non-autonomic nodes do not get autonomic addresses. That sounds a bit silly, but I think it is an important thing to state. This is only something that you'll see on an autonomic node. In other words, if a device is not autonomic, this type of addressing does not apply here. Okay, here's we've separated that into base scheme and sub-schemes, because I think the base scheme is something we can probably agree with relatively quickly. The sub-schemes probably need more discussion. The fundamental idea is we want to use ULA. Turles just pointed that out. We want to use ULA because I don't have a administrative requirement to get a ULA space. I just have to comply to the RFC on how to construct the addressing. And the proposal here is to use the hash of the domain name as the prefix in the ULA. So we assume that the operator puts into the system somewhere on the registrar in the domain name of his domain. And you see across all the documents, we always have the domain name. So there's example.com. Then you do a hash of example.com. The hash creates a pseudo-random value. And that's exactly what the ULA RFC requests, that you or requires that you have a pseudo-random number here. And that makes the first 48 bits the basic prefix, which is unique for a given domain. That has as a consequence, if you have example.com as one domain and you have access.example.com as a subdomain, that the resulting hash would be different. This is not positive or negative, I'm just stating that, so you would have different address spaces. But in reality, this is probably what you want, because that's probably in a separate zone and you want to have that aggregatable in a nice way. Well, this is most of the base scheme. The only thing is, for the sub-schemes, we've been discussing that for a long time, and we believe that it may not be possible to foresee all the possible schemes that we may require in the future. So we suggest we start with one scheme, one sub-scheme here, but we need the possibility to upgrade or to have alternative schemes later on. So we introduce a type field where we can potentially introduce other sub-scheme types later. Now, yeah, let me stop here. Does that cause concerns, or where are we on that?
Max here. Not a concern, but I do note that the bootstrapping document defines the domain ID as the hash of the domain public key. So the bootstrapping document defines the domain ID as the hash of the public key of the domain. which is different than the hash of the domain string, which is, I guess, what you're hashing here.
Okay, okay, we just need to pick one.
We should pick one and be consistent.
Exactly. It doesn't really matter what we pick. What matters is that there is a pseudo-random number that comes out in the end. Okay. So I see no other people coming up. Yeah, Jason.
Jason Coleman. So when you talk about the fact that the pseudo-random prefix is going to be different for a domain and a subdomain, we have yet to define how that's going to work, but thinking down the road with GRASP and trying to route between domains, we need to decide how we're going to handle that from a subdomain point of view, where typically you might want to just route to the parent domain, allow that parent domain to figure out where the subdomain piece is. But if you're having a pseudo-random prefix that's different, that's going to be much harder to do. So we have to, just calling out, we have to think about how that's going to happen, because then you're, 2 hops down as opposed to just kind of hiding the subdomains inside the larger domain. That make sense?
I actually think this is exactly the answer, because the subdomain will result in a completely different prefix, and you just need to know where it's attached, and there you inject a static for that prefix.
So I think that maybe, not sure because I don't know what you're thinking, maybe the fact that you gave the example of subdomain.example.com as a subdomain is confusing the scenario, because I think that in most cases you probably either want completely different ACPs that are totally separate for subsidiary A and subsidiary B of your company, and they're not, the NOCs are not related. It's just 2 entities. The fact is that webx.cisco.com has a different NOC than cisco.com, and therefore when it types it in, gets a different random number is great. But if what you actually want is a part of your network which is sub part of your network, which is still managed by the same thing, and you probably still want the same addresses. You don't want to actually do this.
Right.
Okay, so all I'm saying is I think there's a distinction between I used a domain name that was a subdomain versus I actually want different addresses.
And before we actually go to solving the problem, do we agree that probably we want to be able to address both cases, right? There will be a case, in my opinion, where a subdomain is a separate entity, and there will be a case where a subdomain is managed in the same and you want one ACP. So I think we want to be able to do both. Would you agree?
I just think in the second case, it's probably the word subdomain is not appropriate. In the case where you actually want a single NOC and a single ACP, but some parts of the entity are delegatishable, that you really don't want a separate. If you don't want a separate ACP, then you should use the same numbers everywhere. So the fact that I have my company has subsidiaries in Chicago that have some independent authorization to do things doesn't mean I want to give them different addresses, because I still want to monitor them, and I still want to do the ACP, which means I really want the same set of addresses, because otherwise we get into ACLs and prefixes and other stuff, and I think we really want one prefix, which is the ACP. Okay.
Need to think more.
That's all. So all I'm saying, in the case where you do have subsidiaries that you want part of your organization, I don't think we should use the word subdomain, because I think that will confuse people, because it has meanings in DNS and it has meanings in other stuff like this. We should have some other word.
Can you suggest one?
That's maybe some kind of virtual domain.
A subsidiary domain might work. Okay, a mini domain, a mini domain. I don't know, whatever. Okay, but all I'm saying is I think that you're overloading the term and it's causing confusing.
And if you have suggestions, please post them to the list. I see the problem, but we agree on we agree that probably both cases need to be supported, right? The actual subdomain and a mini domain, whatever you call it. So the comment was
Michael.
we're calling it a we're calling it a prefix here. Why don't we call it a sub prefix? Yeah, but the prefix is only part of the story, right? The prefix is a result of the thing we're discussing. Oh, the hash of what? What do we need to put in the brackets? That's the question.
Can we stop there? You're running out of time, and
Okay.
you have another 3 slides.
Yes. So
we don't
let's take that to the
discussion.
list. But good point, right, Mike? Okay, keep going. So first sub scheme. So now the base scheme is the 48 bits of the domain, the hash of the domain, plus the 3 in the type field. 3-bit type randomly chosen. If anybody thinks it's too much, too little, shout. Now we have in the subdomain, in the sub scheme, the following idea. First of all, depending how big this network gets, depending how it is segmented, we may need some address hierarchy in there. Noting that the way we assign the device IDs right now is not a hierarchical way. Essentially, the addresses in the ACP are identifiers, not locators. The draft mentions that specifically. That means, by default, if you assign device IDs in the way we have suggested, you will not get any form of aggregation apart from if we use something like a zone ID. Right? And so the idea is the following. A node comes up, and it may be a small network, so you don't need zones. Every node gets a zone ID 0, and then its device ID. The device ID is always on its own unique within the domain. If now you need to introduce later a hierarchy in the network, you can then additionally use a zone ID. So you say this node is in zone 1 or 17 or whatever, you end that, and the device though should listen to both addresses, to the 0 address, because that's always its identifier, plus to whichever zone it has been assigned to. And then the zone per se is aggregatable, and that has benefits along some lines. That's the fundamental idea, right? And then we can define all sorts of transit mechanisms, how a node gets into a zone or out of the zone. I don't think this is particularly difficult. We just need to write it down. Then there's another concept which Turles came up with originally, and which I think is a very nice idea. As I said, these are identifiers. They are not really aggregatable. Now, we have cases of devices that have several containers for running a VM, for example. Or we may have a case where we have an ACP, but we have in NFV type, we have several contexts. We may have more than one ACP. So bottom line, maybe we want to separate a little bit. We want to multiplex a little bit different ACPs on the same node in a virtual world. And then it would be very nice if we could, at least on that level, aggregate that so that the node does not then send a /128 out as its identifier, but it sends a /127 if we make V equal 1 bit, or whatever we make that bit boundary, right? So that would allow us, in a virtual world where a node may have several virtual containers, that we actually in the ACP have only one prefix for a node, a /126, 27, whatever. And the V bits allow us to say it belongs into this virtual context. Any comments or thoughts on that? Okay.
No, we don't take this.
We can't take, okay, we can't take.
We're running out of time.
Running out of time. But guys, ladies and gentlemen, I would really appreciate comments on that. So if you have comments, please post them to the list. Because I think this is a great idea, but we need some feedback. So first question is, can we agree on the base scheme? Can I ask for a hum? I would just like a rough idea on what people think. This base idea, if you think this is the base scheme, forget the sub schemes, just this domain hash. Does this sound about right? Is this something we can live with? If
Michael,
so, please hum.
Michael, ask the question on the mailing list.
Yeah, but then I don't get a response. Here I get a quick hum. So let me just ask, who thinks it's not? Okay, so there were some hums and none on the other. It's a starting point, right?
Okay.
Okay. I think we want one sub-scheme initially. Anybody who thinks we should have more, please shout. I'll be more and more specific in the drafts on that. Other thoughts for sub-schemes? Maybe other people have other ideas, please shout. All of this is part of the ACP, so there's the formal question on where this work belongs. I believe it belongs to the ACP milestone, but we have this discussion and I leave that to you to figure out.
No, I think that is clear, and I think it should be left up to the authors whether they want to have a single document or multiple. And at this point in time, if it's multiple, we'll basically.
So it's multiple document for the same milestone.
Yeah, we are going to ask some questions, chair questions now. Thank you. Actually, we intended to ask all those chair questions together now, so to save the time. Basically, as this current slide shows, we are planning to adopt 3 individual drafts in the meeting. So they are the our working group milestones setting up for July. We hope to get good quality. That's why we delay it to now. So I'm going to ask one by one for those 3 drafts we already presented in this meeting. Then we come to the another 2 documents. So yesterday we did present the reference model, which is giving the reference model for the whole atomic network. So does the room feel that draft is mature enough to be adopted? If so, home? If anybody think not, home? Okay, I think we have a clear consensus. I will confirm that on the mailing list after the meeting. The second one is the stable connectivity, which is one of the validation use case draft. If we, the room would like to adopt it, please home now. Good, Mike.
It will be a bit provocative question, Laurence Chavalia. For the 2 use case draft, do we have any other option? I mean, it's part of the working group milestones. There is only these 2 that are allowed. So if we say no, the working group is stalled. So
Yeah, I think if
it's not to oppose, it's just to ask, no, but what's the value of asking if we agree or not, because there is no other option on the table.
Well, but I think that if somebody disapproves, I think we would have that discussion, right? Basically, what would be the suggestion to improve, the outcome of the working group for these 2 milestones, if there was rejection. That's what the hum is for.
I'm still going to ask a question. So now if the room feels a stable connectivity should be adopted, please home. If not, please home. Okay, we'll confirm that on the mailing list. The last one is the prefix management. If the room feels that should be adopted, please home. If not, please home. Okay, we'll confirm that on the mailing list. The next will be the 2 drafts just printed. They are considered as chartered work item. The autonomic addressing is subset of ACP. That's why it's considered as the chartered work item, but there's no milestone. So the question for the room is whether the working group want us to continue on that work. If so, we will probably add the milestone on that work item. Then after that, we'll call adoption. So this is not a call for adoption. The question is whether the working group feels value on this work and would like the working group to work on that work item. Michael?
I don't understand it. There is a milestone for the ACP. The ACP needs addressing. Why do you say this is doesn't have a current milestone? I don't get that. To me, it has a very, very clear milestone.
The milestones are associated with individual documents. This is just how the IETF process works. Well, that's how we understood it. If basically there is a disagreement on how the process works.
I'm really sorry. The reason why I put this into a separate document is because I thought there will be a lot more discussion and need for work on it. That's the only thing. We can also put it back. I really regret having done that because it's really one thing.
Terry Manderson, responsible AD. You can split the milestone out into two different milestones. It's already considered within Charter. So I think the question possibly to the working group would be if you want to adopt this as a working group item.
Okay, then we ask the adoption question. Yeah? Okay. If the working group feels this work is worth to do, then we adopt the document. So if yes, please home now. If not, please home. Okay, we'll confirm that on the mailing list. The next one is pretty much the same. It's a distribution function over GRASP. It's one of the subset of GRASP signaling. So the same question, does the room feel that's a valuable work should take on by the working group? If yes, home. If not, home.
Well, so that is not in the current charter. The distribution, the intent distribution is not in the current charter, or am I wrong?
It's signaling.
So the draft doesn't say intent distribution, right? So I think this is about the efficiency of flooding mechanisms for any type of GRASP messaging. True?
Yes, just the previous version is specific to intent, but this version is the function.
Yeah, I think we are not being very honest here, because in the draft, discuss maybe processes to distribute information, but its intent is one type of information you can distribute. But then why is this more acceptable as a chartered work item than some other stuff that are written in the charter? Intent is mentioned several times, and it's a key element without whom you cannot make it work. But then it's not considered as part of the chartered work item. So I'm saying that the draft is a good start. We need to tackle this topic in the group. I think it's not ready yet for working group adoption. But the other question is, what is the criteria to decide what is a draft that the individual proposed that could be part of the chartered work item? Because there are things that are listed as a milestone that is very clear. But if you read the charter, there is 7 paragraphs where elements are discussed and say that the working group should define this and this and this. And intent is one of that. So it's, I mean, it's a bit messy in my mind what triggers this call for adoption or what is chartered and not.
Okay, point take. So we have the controversial on this work item for now. So, what?
Well, so, but well, I was trying to think of it as a potential part extension of the GRASP signaling charter item, right? And maybe we should really understand how people think about that, because you would like to try to account it under intent for some reason, which
I receive what you say, but then is the general question to say how much we can open or extend GRASP to support different functions or different aspects, because you say information distribution was not part of the initial GRASP goals. Then we say, okay, we need to support intent distribution, then we need to support information distribution. So let's see if it's relevant to have this as a subset or an extension of GRASP, which is fine for me. But then why just have this in the process and not other functionality that could be in GRASP or ACP, which were not initially identified as chartered work item?
I'm going to, sorry, Terry Manderson again, Irresponsible AD. I'm going to highlight a few words here in the charter. Additional documents concerning other autonomic infrastructure components, policy intent, use cases, or autonomic service agents are strongly encouraged as individual submissions or as submissions to the IETF. That is, don't boil the ocean.
Mm-hmm. So maybe what Michael was saying is true, right? So insofar as that additional documents are being brought in that are going beyond the existing GRASP and, for example, ACP documents, right? I think we are having the discussion whether we think they're part of those charter items or other charter items, right? So if you want to avoid that discussion, which may be good or bad discussion, then yeah, put the stuff into the main documents of these.
I really don't want to avoid any discussion. It's just to understand what's the process or what the criteria and to which extent they apply. And just to comment on what Terry just mentioned, I don't know how to understand your comment, because you say, okay, individual draft are strongly encouraged. Individual draft. Here, this is individual draft that potentially can become working group documents. So how do we decide?
Yeah, Joel Yegley. I don't have to define intent here because I'm pretty sure I wrote that text. The issue here is ANIMA has a specific charter. If these things meet the terms of that charter, that is, they are one of the work items that are there, that's great, we can process them. If they don't, you can discuss them here, but they are not going to become working group items. So that doesn't mean that someone like me or Terry or Benoit, if appropriate, will consider sponsoring them. We might do that. But the goal of the ANIMA charter was to be nice and tight and get us to something that was what we set out to do. And then after we do that, we can move on. Right? I think there's certainly the opportunity to do more work, but what we're not supposed to do is spin up 15 things and 2 years from now not have the original charter items not be done. Because if that happens, that was, precisely what we were trying to prevent by doing this. We had before this an IRTF working group or an IRTF research group which studied this space for a long time. So we really got the exploration. We spent 3-4 years on that out of the way fairly early. So that doesn't mean there isn't a lot more that ANIMA could do. It just can't do it under this charter. And that doesn't mean you can't discuss it. It just means that it's not a work item here.
Yeah, actually, we are going to discuss intent next. So.
Yep.
Yeah. One of the option, we avoid this controversial is maybe we could suggest the authors of those two drafts try to merge back to the main draft, like the addressing merge back to SAP and the distribution merge back to GRASP. That maybe solve the issue.
I'm very happy to put the addressing material back into the ACP draft if that makes it easier.
Yeah, I think from the perspective, what is the minimum that we need to do to get these charter items done, right? I think there are lots of things so I don't know how to do the ACP without addressing, right? So from that perspective, at least one addressing is very important. How many more options we need to do now is, I think, the question. On something like the flooding constrainment, right? It seems to me like it may be a great improvement, but how necessary is it short term, right? So I think those are to me the questions if I as a reviewer wanted to see how to prioritize the text.
Jefferson speaking. I think using this as an example, probably the GRASP distribution is not necessary as distributing any kind of information. So probably, I don't know if we have to merge in the entire draft or just the really needed for the the autonomic functions that are in the charter.
Okay. Next. Jefferson. Actually, this is what, not in the current charter, but as we said, we encourage people to come up in the front to discuss that. By discussing that, will develop to become the, potential work item when we, try to recharter this working group. Okay? But before we, we get rechartered, we are not going to adopt it. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so this is Jefferson speaking. Next slide. I'm going to present the main updates of this draft. It's about the format and of the autonomic intention. So the main updates is the addition of some sections on the concept of intent, and also some use case. And also there's the division in two classes of intents. The first one is high-level policy intent and the network level per meter intent, which I'm going to discuss later on the presentation. And also there are some new sections which are still in to be defined mode, but we expect to have some tests for these sections sooner. Next slide. So, as described in the reference model, the intent is an abstract high-level policy used to operate a network. So this is the direct words. And this is the difference of this and the traditional network management system method is that's not necessary to configure each node directly. So the try for the inclusion in this version of the draft is whether we should consider the use case which is previously presented as an intent. So this use case, which describes prefix lengths for IP run, should be assigned an intent, and this is directly written on draft, and also Sheng presented this earlier. So next slide. In the current version of our draft, this is yes, this is an intent. And what we have to ask ourselves is, if this is not an intent, we probably need another source, another format of configuration information in order to do that. So studying this use case, we came to the conclusion that probably would be good to have two kinds of two classes of intent, which are high-level policy intents and the network level parameter intents. So they are mostly two different abstraction levels for intents, but this separation in different kinds also brings some questions. the first question, which I pointed earlier, is there is any configuration parameter of an ANIMA network outside the intents? This is the first open question. The second question is, there are different kind of intents, and I think in the previous meeting, we also talked about some different kinds. So I think this is probably the main question of our draft right now. It's something like we want to divide intents in different classes, levels, abstractions, and all this kind of classification. And now this also leads for some kind of a hierarchy of intents. Next slide. So talking about the use case we added in the draft, the first one talks about an autonomic network, probably an ANIMA network of some operator, which has autonomic function agents for performing load balancing in the network. So in this use case, we have the definition of some configuration information about this load balancing. And for example, the operator can define that for some part of the network, for example, the metropolitan part of the network, we have some kind of load balancing. And for the core network, we can have another level of load balancing. And also probably the intent must be interpreted to come to the conclusion which is each part of the network. Next slide. The second use case, which is also a high-level policy intent example, is how to arrange some VM gas distribution in a network. So in this example, we have a network that can monitor some information like CPU and power utilization. It's kind of a green computing example, and can also control the status of each host machine. So for example, the operator can have some kind of intent which states something like you have to keep the CPU utilization to some extent, for example, 70% or something like this, or you can have the least number, the smaller number of VM activated in a given time, and it's kind of configuration. Slide. So switching to network level parameter intent examples, which are lower level, as we can say, examples. So the use case 3 is when you have the bootstrapping of a new device, it's necessary some kind of information, some information to enable this bootstrapping. So maybe, for example, to reduce the complexity of bootstrapping, they perhaps not to be encrypted. And they can be treated in an expression case of intent, which is the bootstrap intent. So again, we're talking about some classification of intents. Next slide. The fourth use case, which is also a network level parameter intent example. So you can have an autonomic network and connect to internet. So you need an IP prefix for the whole autonomic domain in that area for this operator. So device in this example can configure themselves after the human operator notify the IP prefix for this domain. And in order to have the configuration for each device in the network, we need this information from the prefix to give given the individual addresses. Next slide. The fifth case, also a network level parameter example, is, for example, you can have you need to configure the routing protocol in autonomic domain, and there are some choices like which kind of a protocol, routing protocol do you want to use in that domain. Slide. The sixth use case, I don't need to describe again, is the use case that Cheng described earlier in this meeting. Next slide. So comparing these two kinds of intents, the high-level policy intent and the network-level parameter intent, the first one can have, for example, multiple autonomic function agents related to this intent. Probably it will be necessary some interpretation by a policy continuum interpreter in order to have this high-level policy information translated to lower-level device commands. And also the way that this translation should be done, it's out of the scope of this charter. On the other hand, we have the network level parameter intent, and this is more like it's closer to individual commands that are necessary to configure each device in the network. So this is mostly for establishing the network infrastructure. And also, we think that this is more stable intents, since after the network is configured in the same way, it's not necessary to change this frequently. And also, coordination is not necessary most of times considering these lower level intents. So it's also a division in terms of complexity of each class. Next slide. The ANIMA first focus is the interpretable and implementable intent, at least as this is what is being discussed in the meetings. And obviously, the network level parameter intent is simpler to be realized because it's closer to the device. You don't have some complexity of translation. And also, we include in the draft some related topics that we think it's important to be discussed on the context of this working group. The first one is the distribution of autonomic network intent, which is kind of what the previous presentation, no, not the previous, the version by Bing was about. How to interpret the intent, so in which way each autonomic function agent will interpret the information for intent to come to the individual commands to configure the network, and also how to manage the autonomic network intent. So, for example, you have triggers and intents generates, how you can come to a conclusion, for example, for updates, and this kind of operation, the life cycle of the intents. Slide.
Can I just make a comment as a working group chair? So this is all cool, but the one thing I'd like to see from people thinking about intent as a working group chair is, well, we've been thinking about intent and we've come to the conclusion that, for example, what we're doing right now with GRASP is necessary and sufficient to build an intent system on top of it, or no, we're missing some things, or here are the things we don't really need, right? So that we basically have a tie-in of the people thinking about the next phase into the validity of what we're trying to
You mean like the requirements?
Yeah, requirements, basically it's necessary, it's sufficient. That would be cool, right? If we had an outcome like that. Or for example, no, we think we need a lot more constrainment because intent will only be partial in the network. That would be an argument for Bing's draft, for example, that GRASP should have some more forms of constrainment, right? So linking the thoughts about intent against the underlying components, ACP and GRASP, and making statements about the charter items that we're doing necessary, sufficient, or not, right? So that would be really, really helpful for the working group.
Michael Berenger, I'm not really at ease with your definition of the lower level of intent. To me, intent is a high-level concept, and if it's not high level, it's not intent. Now, I realize I might be smoking something. This may be unrealistic. Service providers will want to fine-tune things. Intent, but what we call intent here may be the right way to do it. But I think we should still try to keep intent a higher level policy, and maybe use something else for the lower level settings.
Yeah, but I think that one of the questions is exactly what you're saying, Michael. Like maybe we just just use the word intent for high level or really high level policies, and all the other stuff we can call, I don't know, maybe policy or something like this. But this is also some subjective, how to say which is a high level policy or not. There are different levels of complexity on the policy. So also.
Max Pritikin. On example 3, when you talked about bootstrapping, you indicated that encryption may not be necessary for that type of intent. I would note that it's not possible because we haven't finished the bootstrapping yet. So
yeah, it's something that, yeah. Thanks for the comment.
Thank you. We take the discussion on the mailing list. Come on. Yeah.
Speak 10 minutes.
Fast.
No, actually, I'm not going to speak too fast because I want to get a few things to be understood. So, though the title of this presentation seems a bit romantic, actually it is tackling some very pragmatic issues related to the bootstrapping of autonomic functions and to the duties these autonomic functions have when it comes to operate and also to be bootstrapped. Not yet, actually, but you can. But okay. So during this presentation, I'll really try to focus on aspects of this draft and also of the draft by Laurent, the coordination draft, which these aspects of the draft that have direct impact on the current working group items. And so that's really going to be the mainstream of my presentation. So first thing, we'll make this little exercise of taking the point of view of a network operator that would like to have an autonomic network. So please, next slide. And this network operator would like to have an autonomic network with the ANIMA framework. And one thing that is really lacking today is guarantees to give him that he will have confidence in what these autonomic functions will do. Today, autonomic functions have no duties with regard to the ANIMA framework, and they cannot be controlled, and there's nothing generic regarding that. And I'm really not confident that an operator would like to have autonomic functions messing inside his network without having any way to get some trust on this behavior of these autonomic functions, capacity to control these autonomic functions, and make sure they have some conflict avoidance strategies in between themselves. Next slide, please. So these things that the operator has in mind regarding is gaining confidence, they happen all over the life of the network. So through the installation, if you remember the presentation of Mikael yesterday, we saw that the ASA are installed inside autonomous nodes. So basically the installation is how you get this piece of software, the ASA, inside the autonomic node. There's the instantiation, which is the second phase. It is you have an autonomic node, and inside this autonomic node, you have some ASA, but which are the pieces of equipment, which are the resources that this autonomic function is going to manage? Okay, and that's the instantiation is how you set this to the autonomic function. How do you say this ASA, okay, this is the piece of equipment that you're going to manage. If you take a load balancing autonomic function, okay, which is the routers on which you are going to play, which are the routers for which you are going to modify the metric in order to do some traffic engineering inside this. The final phase is the operation. It's when the autonomic function is executing, when it's having its control loop being executed. But in this phase, okay, we want to control the way this control loop is being executed. We want to avoid conflicts between these autonomic functions, and we want to share knowledge possibly between these autonomic functions. So the focus of today's talk is a bit on instantiation and mainly on operation. Next slide, please. So at the scale of an ASA, there's a life cycle to follow these three phases. The life cycle, I'm not going to explain it thoroughly today. It's detailed in the draft, but I'm only going to go through the red thread. So once the ASA is installed, I told earlier you have to specify, tell him which are the equipments to manage. So that is the mandate, what we define as a mandate. This ASA is receiving from another entity a message telling him, if we take the example of the load balancing ASA, it tells it, Okay, this is the router on which you have to modify, on which you have to do load balancing. It is instantiating, and after that, it can advertise its manifest. A manifest is going to be the description of all the resources, of the piece of the resources that are being managed. So basically, a manifest will say, okay, I'm a load balancing function, a load balancing ASA, and I am monitoring the load link, the load of link between router A and B, and I may be modifying the metric of the link between A and B. That's what the manifest will advertise. Then once this is done, the ASA is being instantiated, and then it can receive a setup or set down command. It means that there's a mechanism that can tell this ASA run or do not run. Mainly because an operator may not want to have all his autonomic functions working all over his network at the same time. Possibly there are some areas on which he wants to have load balancing, on some other areas he wants to have some energy efficiency. Okay, so there's all these strategies. So you have to be able to set up and set down these autonomic functions. At least for a trust reason, if something gets mad, you want to be able to unplug it. Okay, so next slide, please. So as we have seen, there are some other entities than ASA in the autonomic ecosystem, in the ANIMA ecosystem, and there are some entities which are controlling these autonomic functions. And they are interacting with ASA, so there's something that we could call a NAF, autonomic function management function. It is a meta management function, a coordination function, and information sharing function. Typically, the information sharing function would be something over the grasp intent distribution thing. Okay, so next slide. So what is needed in the ANIMA ecosystem with regards to that? Next slide, please. So if we take the current ANIMA work items and put them together, we have ASA. The ASA are manipulating the network resources through the purple configuration. So they are using netconf, SNMP directly. They don't use grasp for that. But for the signaling in between themselves, for ASA to communicate between themselves, they use grasp. And grasp in itself is using ACP. Okay, so that's the current situation. Next slide, please. Okay, with the next slide, what we propose is to get exactly the same thing and just add some inside the autonomic network infrastructure, this meta management function like coordination, information distribution, and AF management function. And there's one option would be that this autonomic function, this meta function, would use grasp to do signaling with the ASA. As they have to control the ASA, and some of the ASA message are, some of the grasp message allow this, then use grasp to communicate between this meta function and the ASA. Next slide, please. One thing, just a short disclaimer, this meta management function need not be present in every autonomic node. They may be present only on some autonomic nodes because there's not a need to have one per ASA, okay? They are shared, there are commonalities between them, okay? So next slide. So now let's concentrate on the three features that an ASA, that controlling the ASA are. So the first thing is to control when an ASA run. Okay, if I want to unplug it, I need to have this capability. To know what the ASA is doing to the network, okay, if you want to have any trust in it, you need to know that the ASA is modifying the link metric of your routers, for example. Decide which equipments are under the ASA control, or we can say it vice versa. On a given equipment, do I want to have load balancing, or do I want to have load balancing and energy efficiency, and or whatever? Okay, which are the autonomic functions I want to control this equipment? Next slide, thanks. So first point was control when an ASA runs. So we need to send a start and stop command request So next slide, please. So in ANIMA, one of the ideas would be to have GRASP imperative commands type of message inside GRASP to be able to send stop commands, start commands. We've been discussing a bit this with Brian on the mailing list. You can look at this point on the mailing list. Next point, just make 2 slides. Okay. So the need now is to know what the ASA does inside the network. So that's what we've been calling the manifest, which disclose which are the parameters that are being modified and which are the metrics which are being monitored by the control loop of the ASAs. One of the solutions for that would be to use the discovery messages of GRASP to convey this information. And there's, if you want to know more about that, I would let you read the lengthy emails that we've exchanged with Brian on this. Next 2 slides. Okay, thanks. The last point is to decide which ASA control which equipments. So the need is to give instruction to ASA during bootstrapping for this ASA to know what they do. And so the solution is to send a mandate to that. So it is roughly, it has the format of an intent. So we have to make sure that when we specify the format of intent messages that they're capable of coping with mandate. And especially that with the example of mandate that of intent that you've sent, when you send a mandate, say to an ASA to cover that area, you also want to say, oh, on this area, the parameters of the load balancing are this and this. Okay, so that's a reference to that. Okay, so my conclusion would be, we have to send start and stop command. We have to be able to receive manifest from ASA, and we have to be able to send a mandate to ASA. And my next slide would be, final conclusion would be, I think these are things which are very important. I tried during this presentation to get you convinced that we cannot elude such questions if we want to have any chance of getting these ANIMA solutions adopted by operators. Any questions?
Thank you very much. I think from my side again, which I should take to the list, right? So from your analysis, and you know, individually, I think there are things I like and things I don't understand. So nothing that I don't like, right? So, but really, again, just from the process side, right? In this, what have you learned about, you know, ACP, GRASP, what we're doing, necessary and sufficient, right? So I think that would be lovely to have from your analysis of how
I've pointed out what is missing. So
yeah, I think those are higher layers which are necessary for once you have ASAs, right? So these common components that you have in the picture, they seem to be what you are claiming to be necessary to manage ASAs once we have ASAs, right? So from that perspective, I think these components...
But they're inside the requirements for GRASP, not in the draft itself, because I didn't want, at the time I was writing the draft, I didn't want it to propose option like this. But if you look at the drawing, okay, if we want to have autonomic functions, it means that we have to identify the meta functions from the ASA. So I think it put a requirement on the locator of GRASP with regards to make the difference between make a difference when you in the locator to be able to have locators which are meta functions with regards to ASA, for example, in the locator field of the GRASP messages.
I think we will take it outside.
Yeah, okay. So there's plenty of details if you read carefully the emails, and we should also be able to state if we go to, for example, for the manifest, if we go to the solution that we've been discussing with Brian, it has to be documented somewhere. It may not be inside GRASP, but how you format this in GRASP, because we don't want to have 20 of different versions of sending information over GRASP, I would say.
Okay. Okay, thanks you all. We are in perfect timing. We start 2 minutes late. We end 2 minutes late. So.
Blue sheets, anybody not signed?
Yeah, we are missing one of the blue sheets. Where it is? Oh, thanks, Jason. So we have three days left for this week. If you guys want to do some work by your own or by the DI team, you still have the chance to discuss with each other, and hopefully see you guys in Buenos Aires. Yeah, thank you.